Since Backyard Farmer ends so early in the fall, we really don't get much of a chance to talk to you about why sanitation in the garden is such a great idea. We're going to take a look around our garden and see just exactly why we're doing the cleanup and what difference it's going to make when we come to next spring season. We always tell our viewers that one of the best things you want to do is choose varieties that are as disease resistant as possible. With tomatoes, depending on what you're after, you may end up with heirlooms that are pretty disease prone. You may end up also with tomatoes that are really disease resistant, but they grow like a jungle, and they might even continue producing until the first hard frost. If you leave that debris stand, however, you have all sorts of potential problems next year, whether it's the blights of tomatoes or whether it actually harbors all sorts of insects. The other thing that happens is if you leave that rotten fruit on the ground, you can end up with vertebrate pests that can oftentimes be a problem in the garden anyway. So what you're going to want to do is pick off as many of those tomatoes as you can possibly harvest and eat, clean up the debris, get rid of the vines, pull the roots out of the soil, and then ideally get that soil ready for the next spring. Tomatoes are also one of the crops that you want to make sure you can rotate if at all possible, because a lot of the diseases that they do carry can be transmitted in the soil. One of the real interesting things that we have to clean up is, of course, our squash and pumpkins and watermelons, if you're so lucky as to have watermelons. During the season, we talk a lot about squash vine borers, cucumber beetles, all those little insects that can get in there and ruin the vines, ruin the crop, cause gardeners heartache when it comes to actually getting a crop. You can see the debris on the ground under the leaves of our pumpkins, and while we have a great crop of pumpkins themselves, we're going to want to make sure we get all of this debris cleaned up, not only so that it doesn't harbor the eggs of those insects, but we also had some diseases in the foliage this year. This is another location where ideally we're going to do a little bit of rotation of crop if at all possible. Know full well that since we do not spray up here, we probably are going to have vine borers and squash beetles again next year. You may have put in some cool season crops very early last spring, and if you're lucky, they are still producing. This is the Artworks broccoli, which is one of the All-America selections. We actually didn't do the harvesting the way we probably should have, but what this is supposed to do is produce very tiny, small heads as opposed to the giant ones. The cool season crops can go later into the season, and some of them actually increase in flavor after a hard frost, such as Brussels sprouts. That also means that if you're going to do good garden cleanup, you might be doing it in stages. Pull these out later, allow them to complete their cycle, and then get ready for next spring. If you put in cool season crops this fall, you may or may not have had good success, and if you didn't, especially if you're working in a raised bed or in a location where you've done other plantings like this before, you might want to consider going ahead and doing some pretty significant soil amending before next spring. The material you cut or remove from your garden in the fall for cleanup can be put in the compost pile as long as it is pretty disease-free, and especially if you have built a compost pile correctly so that it will get hot enough to kill the diseases and kill most of the insect eggs. This is a great example of one of the compost piles that we use in the Backyard Farmer garden. We lift these sections off, our master gardeners turn it, then we can actually spread that material on the garden either later this fall or in the spring, and it helps enrich the soil and gets rid of all that debris without taking it to the landfill. Be aware, however, also that if you're in a location where all of those voles and ground squirrels and other critters that Dennis Ferraro talks about on the show make the garden their home, they absolutely love going up into the warmth of that compost pile. You might pull the top off of that and discover that you have a bitty family of rodents living in there as well.